Would it be fair to say that transcendence comes and goes as has been emphasized with flow, or is it fully stable?
I view flow as part of a continuum of self-transcendent experiences, and all these self-transcendent experiences are tied together by two major properties. One is a decrease of focus on self, and another one is connectedness with the world.
Flow is an altered state of consciousness. It's a state. It comes, it goes, it's not permanent. But when I think about self-actualization or transcendence, those are not states, those are kind of traits. They exist over long periods of time. And better or worse, flow comes with an enormous rush of feel-good neurochemistry underneath it. All of these experiences are, they're addictive experiences. And if you're just in it for the pleasure ride, that's not going to lead towards growth.
What does it take to do the impossible? What does it take to level up your game like never before? What does it take for individuals, organizations, for even institutions to achieve paradigm shifting? Nothing is ever the same again. Breakthroughs.
Our mission is to decode the neurobiology of flow and cognitive peak performance. Access the minds of maverick scientists, groundbreaking innovators, and world-leading experts to understand what it takes to achieve ultimate human performance, so you can feel your best, perform your best, and accomplish your boldest goals. I'm your host, Rian Doris, and together with best-selling author Steven Kotler, I present to you Flow Research Collective Radio.
Alrighty, so let's dive in. This is a special crowdcast with Steven Kotler and Dr. Scott Barry Kaufman, and we're going to be talking about two big topics, flow and transcendence. The subtitle for today is exploring the intersection of flow, well-being, and transcendent experiences. I actually didn't have an intro prepped for either of you, because I think everyone on here knows both of you, but I'm actually going to throw it to you both, just in case we have any attendees who don't know you, to give a quick overview of each of your backgrounds, and then we'll recap what we're going to be covering today, and we'll dive in with the first question. So Scott, I'll throw it to you if you want to do a really quick intro of yourself, just for anyone who somehow has been living under a rock.
I think I should intro Scott, and Scott should intro me.
I like that. I love that.
No,
no. Yeah, let's do that.
No.
Ladies and gentlemen, Scott Barry Kaufman, one of my absolute favorite people in the universe, really one of the smartest people on the planet when it comes to creativity, and got to be the world's leading expert on Maslow and the early humanist psychologists at this point, and just a great heart and a great mind, and my dear friend, Scott Barry Kaufman. So top that, Scott. Go ahead.
I like that intro. Well, good.
See?
If I don't have to go into all the particulars, in 1946, Stephen got his degree from. I will keep it the same way. And since Stephen is an awesome human, he is one of the best writers of our generation, and thinkers and scientists. People don't know that. But, people don't realize. I've seen papers on neuroscience, papers on all this stuff that will give neuroscientists a run for their money. This guy is I would call you a polymath, is what I would call you if I had to call you something. But really a fun dude, fun guy to chill with as well. So that's my intro for Steven.
That was great.
That's better.
Great.
Better than anything else I would have come up with.
And thank you for those intros. That was super. Ultimately, this is a discussion about how flow and transcendence intersect, and I want to begin by, as Steven often says, defining terms and clarifying the sort of parameters for the conversation by getting clear on how these two, let's just call them constructs, diverge from one another. So I'd love to have each of you define the differences between flow and transcendence or self-actualization, and let's take it from there. Scott, I'm going to throw it over to you to kick us off with that question.
Yeah. I'm happy to kick it off, but I really was curious to get Steven's definition of flow, because I'm not really good at defining flow, and I actually would love to hear Steven's. If I could punt, and then I'll tell him how I define transcendence. Yeah.
So this is one of those funny things, because I don't have a definition of flow. As far as I can tell, science, at least since Mihai Csikszentmihalyi's Boredom and Anxiety, has had a definition of flow, which is flow is an optimal state of consciousness where we feel our best and we perform our best. And if you want to go one layer down, right, into the what does that actually mean psychologically? Csikszentmihalyi says, well, it's a state that has these 6 core characteristics: complete concentration on the task at hand, merger of action and awareness, the vanishing of self, a sense of control, time dilation, and an autotelic experience or an ecstatic experience. That's psychological definition. I colloquially say it's those moments of rapt attention and total absorption. It's so focused on what we're doing that everything else just seems to disappear. That's action awareness, merging, time dilation, self-vanishing. That's all those things. And throughout all aspects of performance, both mental and physical, go through the roof. And that's the autotelic part, plus the sense of control. We don't experience peak performance from the inside. From the inside, it feels like a sense of control, right? So that's sort of how I break that down. But I don't try to go farther than that, because I think everybody keeps reinventing their terms in science. And I think, Mike, as far as I'm concerned, sort of came in and says, well, Maslow had called it peak experience. I'm not 100% certain that we can't take what Abraham Maslow meant by peak experience and translate. I think it captures almost 80% of flow. There's 20% that's left hanging out there that I don't think is covered by the term. But I feel like everybody keeps reinventing the term, which makes it harder and harder and harder to do the research. I'm just like, I don't need to reinvent a term so I can live on my legacy in science. I want to stick with the one we've invented, and I actually would like to push the research farther.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I view flow as part of a continuum of self-transcendent experiences, and all these self-transcendent experiences are tied together by 2 major properties. One is a decrease of focus on self, so self-focus, and another one is connectedness with the world. So it's not just like connectedness with your mother or your friend. It's how much do you feel oneness with the thing you're creating, or even because I see it as a continuum all the way up to the mystical experience, as I see a really extreme version of flow, or a transcendent experience where you feel one with everything. So I see it on that kind of continuum of experiences.
How do you both think about self-actualization or transcendence as distinct or diverging from flow?
I think they're very different things. Flow is an altered state of consciousness. It's a state. It comes, it goes, it's not permanent. And Scott, please correct me if I'm wrong, but when I think about self-actualization or transcendence, those seem to be stable. Those are not states. Those are kind of traits. They're stable. They exist over long periods of time. And better or worse, flow comes with an enormous rush of feel-good neurochemistry underneath it. I'm not sure that neurochemistry comes and it goes, and that how long it lasts is based on biology. Whereas my understanding of self-actualization and transcendence, these are more permanent states and permanent ways of sort of looking at the world and being. And I think it would be closer to where I would start if I was looking at kind of altered state experiences. I would start asking questions about when people use the term enlightenment, right? And a lot of scientists have looked, Andy Newberg, who's a close friend of both Scott and mine, has worked really hard on this. A bunch of other people have worked on it as well. My question is enlightenment, self-actualization, transcendence, are those different things? But flow to me is more like in spiritual metaphysical terms, it's a satori experience. It's a brief glimpse of this possibility of a more stable experience. And does flow over time lead to that more stable experience is an open question. We can debate that, but I'm going to stop here and let Scott talk.
Steven, I actually want to come back to that in a second. And yeah, Scott, I would love your take on this question. If you could also break down the Sailboat Model for people, just to make sure we're all up to speed on that. And then Steven, I'd love to come back to you and ask you about what we know currently about this sort of state to trait impact of flow on transcendence.
And Scott, would you do me a favor before we go anywhere, for folks who haven't heard these terms before? Can you define both self-actualization as Maslow or yourself understands it, and same with transcendence, so we can just ground our terms a little bit?
Yeah, that'll be really helpful. I was going to do that anyway, but that's really going to be really helpful. Yeah, so transcendence, self-actualization can be thought of as what is the creative potential that you uniquely have, that if realized will really make will really show the uniqueness of yourself. See, Maslow really distinguished between the basic needs we have and share with others, like the need for connection, the need for self-esteem, the need for safety. Those things are very, very important, but they don't make you very special to say, I care about connections. Everyone cares about connections. They want to make connections. But when you say, like, I can play a cello sonata like no one else can, then you're in a different category. Do you know what I mean? You're like, we're talking about your unique creative potential. And that's how I like to think of self-actualization. But there doesn't necessarily have to be a pro-social or a societal contribution aspect to self-actualization. I do believe you can self-actualize, and it doesn't always have to be like this world changing, like, saving the children. Sort of, there's many, many ways people can self-actualize. I'm often asked, well, if you, and I'm curious what you think about this, but I'm often asked, like, if you're alone in like the woods and you write poetry your whole life and it's beautiful poetry, but you hide it in a box and you never share it with the world, is that person self-actualizing? Yes, I would say yes. Like, who's
well, you're asking, that's Emily Dickinson.
Yes.
I mean, she didn't hide in the woods, she hid in an attic, and
Right.
nobody saw it until she was dead, but that's Emily Dickinson, right? Like,
Right.
and I don't know if she's self-actualized, but if you've read her poetry, she is definitely awake.
Yeah, it's beautiful poetry. But I see that as a difference between that and transcendence. So with transcendence, Maslow actually viewed self-actualization as just a bridge to transcendence, whose function, I thought this was very poetic. He said its function is like to erase itself, because ultimately with transcendence, you're using your highest creative potential in a way where there's no boundary anymore between self and world, so that what is automatically good for you is automatically good for the world. And he called it synergy. That phrase synergy is really a beautiful term that really only comes when you're talking about transcendence, in my view. And I'm obviously talking about horizontal transcendence. My theory of transcendence is very horizontal, as opposed to vertical transcendence. Like, I'm enlightened and you're not. That would be vertical transcendence. People who take do the yoga downward dog facing pose and think they're enlightened all of a sudden because they did that, as opposed to
wait a minute, hold on. You mean that's not true?
No, not necessarily. There's no, having your
I'm really disappointed. I've been doing yoga for a while. My dog is down. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
All right.
It can help. I got nothing against yoga. I'm sure there's plenty of people in this room who love yoga. And that can
I've
be
been doing it for 30
great.
years. I love it.
It can be great. It can be great. But if you shoot to the top of, this imaginary pyramid that Maslow never even drew, thinking that if you just shoot for transcendence, all of a sudden all your other needs are going to magically, like your need for ego is going to magically disappear. You've got another thing coming. Like, that's not the way that humans work. So that's why I really believe in this. Self-actualization is really, really important first, to really integrate yourself and really get really clear in who you are and what you can offer the world before you transcend it.
Scott, can you just elaborate a little bit more on your sailboat model here as well? And then Steve will come back to you on the flow side.
Yeah. Just so in a nutshell, it turns out that the humanistic psychologist Abraham Maslow never drew a pyramid. And even though a lot of people have heard of this hierarchy of needs, where you see needs for safety, need for belonging, need for self-esteem, and then need for self-actualization. So he never drew it that way. He never thought about it that way. That were a bunch of psychology and management textbooks that just missed the boat on that one. So I think a better way to actually describe Maslow's theory is through a sailboat, in the sense that we have security needs and growth needs. We have both. Both are very, very important in our lives. And they do have a certain priority. So hierarchy of needs does make sense to a certain degree, in a sense that if you're with too many holes in your boat, in your sailboat, where are you moving? You're not moving anywhere. You need to focus all your attention and resources on plugging that boat. But ultimately, you have to be vulnerable and open that sail if you want to move in the direction you most want to go. So the sail and the boat are both very important. And also, there's a lot to the metaphor, in the sense that you can go all the way with this. So we're all moving in our own boats, but ultimately we're all in the sea together. So we ultimately, what we do really does have impact. And so same with the stressors, like waves, like COVID. Waves can come crashing down on all of us at once, but we still have to move into the port So values and purpose is a big part of the sailboat metaphor as well. When that sail is open, you're moving to the port that you want to sail, and knowing that there's all these stressors in life and all these things that could come crashing down on us, but you still have to move. The point is, you still have to keep choosing growth day after day after day.
Scott, can I ask a geeky sort of neuro-based version of what we're talking about?
Of course.
Which would be good. Thank you. So we know when you talk about, when you were earlier defining the path towards self-actualization and transcendence, very important in your definition was, what happens when the border between self and other disappears when we feel cosmic unity, right? And we know from Andy Newberg's work, Judson Brewer's work, a bunch of other people's, we know what's going on when that happens. We know that's activity in the temporal parietal junction, the right parietal lobe, a couple other things. And we know this obviously shows up in deeper flow experiences, right? Flow is a continuum of experiences from micro flow states to macro flow states. And usually that continuum is described by, I name those 6 characteristics of flow. And when they're at 1 or 2, that's micro flow. And when they're turned up to 11, that's macro flow. As we move up to 11, widely acknowledged that some of the quote unquote more mystical spiritual experiences, out of body experiences, cosmic unity, happen. In flow, one of the things that you get that's very interesting and is it's not just you become one with everything, you tend to become one with whatever you're focused on, right? When I was writing Rise of Superman, I told that Dean Potter experience. He became one with a bird. Surfers talk about becoming one with the ocean, blah, blah, blah. That's actually, fairly common. So what's interesting to me is that it's a small chunk of the flow experience. And, in a sense, it's often treated, I don't want to say as ephemera, but it's like the fireworks. Flow is about peak performance and creativity and it's an action state. And while there's more subtle metaphysical experiences, and people are obviously deeply moved by it, what's interesting to me is that Maslow, in your definition, that you've privileged this one, I don't know if it's an epiphenomenon, but it's like one aspect of it into meaning. And I'm not saying that's wrong. I'm just sort of noticing it and listening to you talk and wondering about it.
I think one area of potential disagreement from us, which is always good, would be boring if we're just I agree on everything, is flow as action, high performance. Maybe there is an important distinction between peak performances and flow. If you're gonna see flow that way, I see peak experiences as not about high performance. I see peak performance as not necessarily the same thing as peak experience. Although
totally, different things.
Yeah. And if that's the case,
they can overlap.
They can overlap. They can, but they don't necessarily overlap. That's a great point. Great point, Rian. So I think that there might be value then in not treating peak experiences synonymous with flow experiences, because a lot of the kinds of experiences Maslow was describing I don't think they'd be things that we would naturally think of as high performance things. Like childbirth. Do you see childbirth as high performance? I guess it is in a way,
Well, from a survival of the species perspective, is there a moment that matters more? I mean, if you're talking about real peak performance, right? I don't know. This metaphor goes in places that I don't want. It's funny in a bunch of different ways, and I'm not meaning it that way. But from an evolutionary perspective, you're raising a very interesting question. I don't have the answer, but it's an interesting question.
It's an interesting question. I think of that one because that's a very common peak experience for women.
It is.
But watching a sunset, when you're enjoying a quiet time with a friend and you really feel like you're one with the friend, is that high performance? I don't think that makes sense in that kind of situation.
So let me, by the way, high performance is a tricky term here, I guess.
Please define it for us.
Yeah, well, I don't know if I can define it, first of all, but the point I was going to make is some of the skills that we know are amplified during flow, cooperation, collaboration, empathy, right? These are not normally peak skills, but if you and I are sitting and having interpersonal flow, we're lost in a deep conversation, heightened collaboration, cooperation, pattern recognition, all the stuff that you get in flow, we're going to have more connection. It's going to be a deeper conversation. And, I would call that peak performance because, first of all, fundamental human needs are, we have social needs. So like from a performance benefit, if I can have a 10-minute conversation with you in flow and bond with you really, really tightly, it's saving me from having hours and hours of a conversation to try to find the same thing elsewhere. So there's a productivity aspect to this interpersonal idea, even though you and I wouldn't think about it that way, but you could reframe it that way.
Well, you have a very unique take on this. And this also relates to something Brent Hogarth wrote on Twitter. He put a link to an article of the kind of state where non-achievement is, there's no goal for achievement.
So
you took issue with this.
Sorry, Brent, I love
this is
you.
relevant.
I know you're out there. Yeah,
well,
but
this is relevant to our conversation.
Here's why I take issue with it. The idea of non-achievement flow, right? This is flow in non-goal-oriented situations, and everybody always brings up play as an example of non-achievement. And I would totally agree with you, except from an evolutionary perspective, we know what play is doing. Like there's books and books and books, and you've read them, and I've read them, and a lot of people have read them.
I love play.
It's serving, whether it's skill acquisition or teaching morality or ethics, like those are all performance-based things in a sense. I don't think there is like, and even non-goal directed play, the goal of play is the continuation of play, it's the learning of, like there's always goals wrapped into that. I think this is one of these things where the European Flow Association really got hung up on these questions for a very long time. A lot of people studied this question in flow research for almost 10 years. And I never quite got it. And this could be me being stupid, but I can't wrap my head around what it means, because there's always some kind of, we're a goal-oriented machine. There's no such thing as non-goal directed behavior. Can't really happen.
Steven, I think just on that note, it might, I think there may be a sort of a semantic component there where people are using goals in a different sense. So maybe you can break down what you mean by goal-directed machine versus someone explicitly kind of consciously setting a goal and then doing an activity.
Oh yeah, I'm not like literally. So the goal-directed system, the sequence system, is your dopamine system, and every millisecond, dopamine goes up and down based on future prediction. The brain is always trying to predict what's going to happen next and how much energy do I need for it, right? Where is the organism going next? How much energy do I need for the challenge? And, we get prediction errors, basically. Is this right or is this wrong on a moment-by-moment basis with dopamine, right? If our prediction is wrong, the dopamine goes away. If it's right, we get a little bit more. But this happens every millisecond that we're alive. And this is the goal-directed system. So when I say we're goal-directed machines, I mean at a really foundational level. Unless you're going to bypass the basal ganglia and the entire dopamine system that's attached to it, there is no such thing as non-goal directed behavior, as far as I can tell from a neuroscience perspective.
A lot of that sort of goal direction is not necessarily happening within conscious awareness, Steven, is it? Or are these?
Yeah, I think it's, so here's something interesting. This same system, which is a goal directed system, what about non-duality and oneness? So we know neurobiologically what's involved when we have experiences of non-duality and oneness. We have a good idea what's going on in the brain at the same time. This goal-directed system, non-duality and oneness have to be the least goal-oriented states you could possibly think of, because there's no more self, right? All those things are gone, have fallen away, but this goal-directed system is still at work underneath it all. So from a neurobiological perspective, I hear these arguments, but they don't make any sense to me. It sounds like you're having psychological arguments. You're arguing about terms that don't actually have precise neurobiological meanings. And once you get one level down to the neurobiology, this is not real.
See, before I get into my own personal opinion on this, just a meta commentary. It's fascinating that you feel that way, considering that Mihai Csikszentmihalyi's original, he wanted to call it the autotelic personality. His whole, that autotelic literally means with no goal.
I know.
So he actually, the original, what he wanted to do with flow originally was to treat it as a goalless, sort of intrinsically enjoyable activity.
Okay, so that's a fair point. Yet, if you go back and look at like the origin of the thinking of flow, comes out of, you go to read Beyond Boredom and Anxiety, Mihai Csikszentmihalyi's very first book on this. The foundational thought that led him to flow, he didn't discover flow. He discovered the challenge skills balance, and the challenge skills ratio was always leading towards this state. The challenge skills ratio, by definition, says there's a task, I have the skills or I don't have the skills to meet this task. That's a goal-oriented system. That's like the task, I need to accomplish the task, that's a goal, I have the skills or I don't. That was his foundational thinking. So he could, whatever
his examples were different.
Example, I mean, I'm not saying he's wrong, but I'm saying that his own research and where he started with these questions point in a different direction. I wish if Mike was still alive, we could have this conversation. It'd be awesome.
Oh my gosh, it would be absolutely incredible. And we really would love to get your thoughts in the chat box. I mean, there's a lot of really amazing people in this room that could equally be up here on the stage.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
almost all of you all, except for one. I saw one person. I was like, I don't want them on the stage. No, I'm joking. That's my sense of humor. That's my sense of humor. But the goal-directed point you're making, if we really want to nerd out about it, I mean, it is true that humans are cybernetic systems. And if you study the science of cybernetics, you realize that that is what we are. So we have a goal. We have lots and lots of goals, that some of that are pre-programmed through the course of human evolution, but we also have those that we create consciously in our own lifespan that can't be completely traced back to evolutionary goals. So it's actually useful to distinguish between self-actualization goals versus evolutionary evolved goals. That's one important distinction I would make. So like mating, right? You're not special if you say, I want to have sex, right? You're not, does that make you particularly creative to say that, I
want to build on the goals debate a little bit here. Scott, something you said in Transcend was, it is precisely when the foundational structure of the self is shaken that we are in the best position to pursue new opportunities in our lives. And Scott, I would love if you could speak to that. And then Stephen, if you could speak to the way in which the foundational structure of the self is changed in flow, and what impact that may have outside of flow experiences on personality or trait rather than state changes. But Scott, we'll start with you.
Wow, what great questions. Well, what you're kind of referencing is linked to post-traumatic growth and that field. So, when we have these kind of seismic earthquakes, psychological earthquakes, where our assumptions about the way the world works has been foundationally violated in many different kinds of ways that can be possible, where we thought the world was safe, and then things happen to us. Or with COVID, we thought, oh, could you ever imagine a world where you couldn't just be free walking outside without a mask? And now we're always like, oh, did I bring my mask with me? So I would call that a psychological seismic earthquake. Usually in those kinds of moments, though, there is an opportunity for growth. There, we often treat it as though, oh, well, the old is gone, so therefore what good could possibly come out of this? But actually, there can be a very, very strong shifting in priorities and newfound sense of purpose and meaning and connection with others in lots of very meaningful ways. So yeah, that what you mentioned there is a very strong link to the field of post-traumatic growth.
So I think Scott, I have to agree with Scott. I think that anytime the self gets shaken, right, and you're forced to have a different perspective on yourself, right, than normal, that's where growth emerges. Right, where the self vanishes, the self gets foundationally shaken. What's really interesting about flow to me is that is a very good definition. I mean, the self dissolves in flow, right? You're getting outside the self, and what's interesting to me is it doesn't always flow. Sometimes Scott and I were just talking about this. We know that flow over time increases empathy and it increases ecological awareness. All these sort of things that would lead one towards transcendent self-actualization. But if flow was instant self-awareness and instant enlightenment, as years ago somebody pointed out, like every surfer would be a Buddha. That's not the case. So, it's not a one-to-one. Just because you're having a flow experience and you're getting outside the self doesn't mean you're growing, right? You still, and this is the same thing with psychedelic experiences. You can have you can go to parties and do psychedelics all the time and watch your consciousness explode and just be wanting to get laid, right? You're not like using it as a personal growth tool. You're using it to fulfill, basic needs. No judgment here. Fine. Like I have no problem with that. But you're not doing the work towards self-actualization in the way we would think about it. So I don't think flow or any of these transcendent experiences where you get outside the self guarantee growth. But I think that makes it it's a hell of a lot easier, right? When you're so tucked inside your shit, at least for me, when I'm so tucked inside my shit and, everything's going on, I can barely get outside my head, let alone get kind of broken open the way that you need to really sort of get the distance from the self for growth. Now that just may be me, and I may be hard-headed and dumb, but that's sort of how I think about it.
Well, we were kind of talking about this a little bit just earlier, just before this webinar, we were shooting the shit a little bit, and we were talking about that. I do think that there's a real deep wisdom there behind what you said, and that the flow state comes along with it almost necessarily a less of a focus on self. And that's what makes it a self-transcendent experience. That's what puts it on the continuum. I mean, I do see flow as on that continuum I call it actually the unitary continuum. My colleague David Yedin and I call it that. But but it's on there, and you can increase a sense of unity with what you're working on, but you can then start to expand that and increase your sense of unity, like I said earlier, to the grandiose mystical experience where you feel one with everything, the universe, you do enough drugs, you'll be one with everything,
So just to counter that for a second here, do you both think that, because we've kind of loosely touched on the relationship flow can have to, accelerating transcendence and growth, can the opposite be the case, where there are potential downsides with respect to flow from becoming, as you call it, Scott, the whole human? Let's say, for example, if someone's prioritizing flow before some more fundamental needs like connection, safety and security. Examples that come to mind might be, adrenaline or flow junkies, extreme athletes, I think workaholism potentially may fall into this category. So I'm curious if there is a role that flow can play in actually sort of limiting or inhibiting growth or transcendence.
Wow, what a great question. What do you think, Steve?
Great question, Rian.
What do you think, Rian?
Yeah, let's start there. What do you I think yes. I think yes, I'm not going to hold back why.
We don't have to foot the foot, but I'm sure you have a good thoughts on it, but no pressure.
I'll answer after you.
Okay.
I don't want to I have a clear opinion in my head, but I don't want to taint the discussion with it.
So I absolutely do think so. From within my model of self-actualization, you can be getting into flow and lots of things that are not your highest creative potential, and it can be taking your time and energy away from the things that you could be doing to get into your highest creative potential. It's kind of similar to my criticism against growth mindset theory. Carol Dweck's that everyone loves. Everyone loves it unanimously, and I feel like it's. I've loved the research on it, and I think it's important, but I also think it's important to recognize that what's not worth doing is not worth doing well, which is a Maslow quote. And a lot of people might have a growth mindset for things that are not actually helping them grow as a whole person. And therefore, why should we be extolling the merits of growth mindset in that case? You can have a growth mindset for anything. Serial killers can be like, I believe I can kill 5 more people next week than I did last week. Whatever. That was a really morbid example. But my point, that was my extreme example to show you that just applying a growth mindset to something doesn't make it in and of itself growth oriented. And that's the point that I wanted to make in my book, Transcend. And that's kind of how I would answer that question.
I think flow, a lot of the psychedelic experiences, the stickier meaning more addictively fun, meditative experiences, right? they all, like Andrew Huberman said this. He said,
Hmm.
better living through chemistry still requires better living. And I think that's that's true if you're talking about flow, if you're talking about any of these transcendent states. If you just get addicted to the feel good neurochemistry that's generated, then you've just got addictive behavior, right? It doesn't matter. I mean, you could be addicted to flow, or you could be addicted to cocktailing MDMA and cocaine to get at the same neurochemicals that you get. You know what I mean? Like, I don't think addictive behavior is addictive behavior is addictive behavior. And I'm not saying bad or good, right? I think there are certain paths towards transcendence that might go through that kind of behavior. I think all of these experiences are, they're addictive experiences, and if you're just in it for the pleasure ride, that's not going to lead towards growth. I don't think automatically, or if it is, it's very slow. It's very slow, as far as I can tell.
Yeah,
looks like we're in agreement on this.
And the research on dark flow has been showing that it actually accelerates addiction if you experience flow in addictive activities as well. So it actually can kind of exacerbate that even further.
I'll give you another example where you see it a lot. The pro surf tour, a lot of the pro action sports tours, very high flow environments. People don't want to come down after the competition, so they're using drugs to keep themselves on a flow high. And a couple years ago, there were like 4 or 5 overdoses on the pro surf tour in 1 year. It was nuts. And what you're looking is people not wanting to come down from the huge flow high that is competition. I mean, okay, I don't know if that's all you're looking at, right? Addictive behavior has a lot of I can't say that, but part of what contributes to that, I believe, is you get this huge flow high and then you don't want it to go away, so you chase it with addictive states. But I think this is a problem in general for flow. Even if you're not chasing it with drugs, you're chasing the flow high because you don't want it to end. And that's not a good recipe for a high flow lifestyle. If you keep chasing after the state, you're going to exhaust all the neurochemicals that show up in the state. It's going to be harder to get back into flow. So you can end up locked out of flow for a longer period of time than you want anyways. It's counterproductive one way or another.
Yeah, reminds me of chefs. There's extremely high alcoholism within chefs, I think for a similar reason, where the flow can be so intense that they can't come down. And stand-up comedians talk about not being able to sleep after doing a set, for 6, 7, 8 hours, and often use kind of substances to mitigate that. I'm going to start pulling up some questions here that we've got from you all. So, first question, and Scott, I would love you to speak to anything that may be relevant from your expertise in intelligence and creativity here. What kind of studies between ADHD and flow have been done? This is a common question, Stephen, I know you get. She says, it appears to me that there are some pretty solid parallels, but I've been unable to find anyone specifically doing this research. Can you point me to these studies if you know of anyone doing this work? So flow and ADHD, I'm curious for both of your takes there.
Yeah, I could start off with that. I recommend checking out my Scientific American article, The Creative Gifts of ADHD. Working with neurodiverse kids, which is I part of my career is working with people on different spectrums, the ADHD spectrum, the autism spectrum, dyslexia, other kind of spectrums. It's part of the neurodiversity movement. You find that people who have been diagnosed with ADHD tend to get what's called hyperfocus. And I don't know if it's the same thing as how Steven conceptualizes flow, but there is a real phenomenon where when it comes to a thing that they really love doing, the activity where they can engage in their default mode network or their imagination brain network and get deeply absorbed in that network, as opposed to having to be forced for their attention to be outside of themselves. Like when watching a boring lecture, their attention is all over the place. But if you can get them deeply engaged in their associative network and their imagination brain network, they actually tend to show stronger hyperfocus than people who haven't been diagnosed with ADHD. So there's a hidden gift there under certain contexts.
I have zero expertise here whatsoever, right? So I'm outside my lane, but I will say that Ned Hallowell, who is the one who coined the term ADHD, has and who I've worked with and known over the years, Ned has argued exactly what Scott just argued, that he believes that ADHD is actually an evolutionary development that makes people more flow prone, more able to generate the hyperfocus needed for flow. I don't know enough to speak learnedly on this. I really don't. I just found it very fascinating. And I will say, as somebody who has attentional challenges, right? Depends on where you want to put down that particular spectrum. Yeah. What I will tell you is that I think a lot of what we're doing when we talk about things like lining up intrinsic motivation, the work that we do at the collective in terms of aligning curiosity, passion, purpose, autonomy, and mastery, pointing in the same direction, using cognitive reframing to find, autonomy and things like that. What we're doing is basically creating the conditions that say, whoever you are, if you reframe this possibly, you can end up with that hyper focus, right? We know, for example, autonomy and attention are coupled systems, right? We've known this since the 1990s. So I think a lot of sort of not the work flow per se, but a lot of the work I cover, like in the first section of Art of Impossible on the motivation stuff, is about how do you align intrinsic goals and intrinsic motivators in this way. So if you are neurodiverse, this is how you play these games, and this is how you be effective. Yeah, I'll stop there. Rian, what do you think?
The research I've seen on flow and ADHD shows that heightened focus is possible for people with ADHD, but it's modulated by interest, interestingly enough. So when there's interest that captures attention, the attention that gets captured is more intense than someone without ADHD. But it's the capturing of the attention in the first place that often is so difficult for people with ADHD. It's like it's harder to channel. It's kind of but once it is channeled, it from what I've seen research-wise, it can be more significant, the amount of focus. I actually used to know a lawyer, interestingly enough, and she had really, really severe ADHD, and she used to get into these 24-hour flow binges working on case law, to the extent they were so intense that she ended up having bladder issues because she wouldn't go to the bathroom for 24 hours sometimes because she would be so absorbed. Her susceptibility to absorption was so high. So just one interesting extreme example of that.
Fascinating.
Yeah, really, really fascinating. So we've got the most upvoted question here, which is a simple one, but lots of good things to say on this, I'm sure. What's the difference and or similarities between mindfulness, flow, and transcendence? And so I think we've kind of touched on differences between flow and transcendence. So let's talk about differences between mindfulness and flow and transcendence.
Can I close the thing in the neurodiversity thing for a second?
Please. Yeah.
Please.
Because the really interesting thing is, like, even people on the autism spectrum, when you get them in flow, I won't say they're more likely to get in flow, but if you can use flow as an intervention. So you get them into flow, a lot of their tics and insecurities and things that as neurotypical people that they would call awkward tend to disappear, just completely evaporate, because they have areas of special interest. And this relates to what you were saying. A lot of people with autism, if you get them talking about their area of special interest, it could be a really, really narrow thing like magic card game or whatever. But you ask them, what's your favorite magic card? Once they start, you get them started and they're talking about it and they get in the flow state, a lot of their tics disappear, and a lot of they like characteristic symptoms of autism disappear. So I think really flow is a really undervalued diagnostic, not diagnostic, but just intervention tool. People with lots of different neurodiverse spectrums. Yeah.
Flow proneness as well is another subject that more research is definitely.
So I just wanted to close the loop on that. Yeah.
Super.
Thanks, Scott.
Scott, do you want to take it from on the differences or distinctions between mindfulness and transcendence?
Well, that's an interesting question, because I was actually going to ask Steven what he thought of the difference between mindfulness and flow, because a lot of people, no one's been able to crack that nut. Like, people have written papers on it.
Yeah, I disagree. I think a lot of people have I don't think this is even a question anymore.
Tell me the answer then. I missed the memo.
Yeah, I mean, well, it depends on whose work on mindfulness you want to draw on. But for example, if you look at Judson Brewer's work at Yale and what he was looking at in the brain, and this is, One of the interesting differences is in the medial prefrontal cortex, which becomes in a lot of flow experiences becomes very, very active, whereas you get most other parts of the prefrontal cortex falling away. And in mindfulness, the medial prefrontal cortex gets very quiet. So why would it be active in flow and inactive in meditation? It's because one of the things the medial prefrontal cortex does is creative self-expression. So flow is a creatively self-expressive state. Always. That's what it is. In mindfulness, you are trying to get past the self. But let me take this one step further. We can talk about, mindful-based stress reduction or any of those things, but if you go back to the wisdom traditions, right, and want to talk about like Dzogchen, Tibetan Buddhism, and their purpose of their meditations are to make you aware of awareness, to be aware that there is a field of neutral awareness that exists behind your consciousness. Now, an argument can be made, this is exactly what flow gives you. It's the same thing. The self gets shut off and you get to sort of perceive the world with the self dialed down. That seems to be very similar. So the things are the same. The difference seems to me about creative self-expression, and does the self disappear, or do you need part of the self for what you're doing? But neurobiologically, this is why I say I think the question has been answered. Neurobiologically, we've seen differences in the brain between flow and mindfulness experiences. But I think I think you hit on it really well at the beginning, where you said, hey, these are spectrums of experiences. Flow is a state. Mindfulness is a practice, right? There's no state of mindfulness. We're not talking about that. And if you go into any of the traditions of mindfulness, they have different words for it, right? And essentially, mindfulness is a rough translation of the Tibetan word for meditation, which basically means just studying the mind, paying attention to the mind. The goal of mindfulness is to watch how the brain works. How do you think? How does it add, in Tibetan Buddhism, you're mindful because you want to see things like your biases get attached to thought, right? Most people don't realize that you can have a thought separate from when your biases get attached to it, when all those other things happen. That's what mindfulness gives you. That's very similar to the same state you're getting to in flow. But because flow serves a different purpose, we don't tend to notice the same things. But I do think those questions have been answered. And I think the only people who are willing to have who are having these discussions out loud, I think psychologists love these discussions because they're still using language that is essentially metaphorical. And neuroscientists will look at it and go, okay, well, let's talk about mechanism. And if you want to ask Andrew Newberg these questions, he's going to talk about different parts of the brain coming on and off, and the spectrums of absorption and spectrum of how much is the self present, right? We talk about, here's another one. In the Transcendent Experience catalog, there's experiences like flow where you have total sense of control. And then there's, on the other side, experiences like speaking in tongues, trance states, possession states. These are legitimate altered states of consciousness where there are changes in the brain where you lose all control. It feels like somebody else is running the show. You're no longer in charge. There's a bunch of these spectrums under the heading of mystical experiences or transcendent experiences and things along those lines. But mindfulness and flow is like apples and oranges. It'd be like comparing the process that we use to get into flow triggers to flow. You could say, well, what's the difference between mindfulness and a bunch of flow triggers? That's a great conversation. Okay, we can have that conversation. But mindfulness and flow, one's a state, the other's a process.
That's very interesting. I mean, couldn't one make that, just to play devil's advocate, couldn't one view mindfulness as getting into the flow state of the contents of that flow state is your own self? So it's actually like, it's an interesting state of consciousness where you're actually like deeply in flow, witnessing your own self thoughts.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, Scott. There's a paper on this that asks that exact question, whether the activity that gets you into flow could be the witnessing of stimuli that you do in mindfulness. It argues that can't be the case because the witnessing of conscious stimuli decreases absorption, which is obviously one of the characteristics of flow, and it increases sort of metacognition.
That's why you find that neuroscience differentiation between those two mental states. So that's why, but just conceptually, it seems like that's what it is. It's like it seems like you're getting into, but maybe we don't want to use the word flow for that. But I just asked the question just out of sake of stimulating conversation.
Is there a neurological signature for self-actualization or transcendence, do you believe?
I do think there's for self-transcendence. I do. And I think that the Andy Newberg has done some nice work on that, showing our whole sense of perspective of stemming from the self. Everything's rotating around the self. You know, it really changes your perspective. You're suddenly not from Earth anymore, looking up at the stars. Right. You're suddenly the sun looking down at Earth. It's like, what the hell just happened? But self-actualization, now I would argue that's a more interesting question in a way, because no one's really fully cracked that nut. So the neuroscience of self-actualization, you could see how when there are certain states that we're in where we're moving in the direction of what's really truly good for the organism, you know, it would be really fascinating to see if that's associated with a certain neural imprint. Wouldn't that be cool?
Mm-hmm.
Like, wouldn't that be really
super cool?
Like,
yeah, super cool.
Like if we had some sort of meter eventually someday where we could actually like do an EEG, and it's like, it's a beeps, yes, you're moving in the direction of personal growth, or like, no, that's not, like, do not pick her to go on a date with, that's not growth, you know, or like whatever is, don't eat that food, that's not going to give you self-actualization. That would be really amazing, maybe even through machine learning. You know, it sounds like I'm being cheeky, but you could see a universe in which, you know, you do a longitudinal study with machine learning or whatever, and you start to like learn certain patterns of the individual, of the moments, and what the consequences are when they move in certain directions of growth versus other directions of growth. You could sort of see kind of that kind of study. We need funding for it. But.
Yeah, no, I mean, not like, you know, if self-actualization and transcendence is this sort of stabilization of the oceanic boundless experience, right? Like the border between self and other becomes much more fluid and porous. That would, you know, and this again, back to Andy Newberg's work. And somebody, by the way, in the questions, this is the same answer. Somebody wanted to know more about the neurobiology of possession experiences and speaking in tongues experiences. I can't remember which of Andrew Newberg's books it's in. It's not the first. He talks a little about it in the book he did with Eugene DeQuilly, his very first book, The Mystical Mind, but it's some of his later books. I'm missing which one it is. He studied specifically speaking in tongues, which is a version of the possession experience. I want to pull back to the conversation we were having earlier about crystallized intelligence.
Yes.
And
crystallizing experiences.
Crystallizing experiences. So let me frame this for people. This is a flow transcendence kind of question. When you're dealing with younger adults, teenagers, identity formation, there are certain experiences that happen, these crystallizing experiences that Scott's talking about, where you recognize yourself in the world. Like the first time I sort of read E. Cummings' poetry, I didn't even know what I was looking at, but I knew I was a writer. Like if this guy was a writer, I was a writer. I recognized myself in the thing I was looking at. That's a crystallized experience where you see something of yourself in the world. And it's usually, not always, but it's usually often underpinned by flow. And so my question to Scott was just, what's the relationship between flow and crystallized experiences, and how does he think about these things, especially in relation to self-actualization and transcendence?
So the thing with the crystallizing experiences, what is this moment where you encounter something and you're like, wow, that's me? You know, for me, like I remember when I was taking cognitive psychology in college and I came across Robert Sternberg's theories of intelligence. I was like, that's what I want to do with the rest of my life, is study the science of intelligence. I mean, there was a specific moment, and Howard Gardner calls that the crystallizing experience. Well, I think it's a really cool that you link that to flow, Stephen, because I mean, I was locked in so much. There's something very poetic about that. It's almost like flow for life. There's a deep kind of flow associated with the crystallizing experience that kind of sets you off in an instant for a life of flow. You know what I mean? There's something very profound about that.
Well, that's exactly what I wanted to get at, is that when we have these crystallizing experiences, in a sense, it's the organism giving us a recipe for flow. That's definitely one of the things that seems to be going on.
Recipe
You know
for
what I
flow.
mean?
Yeah.
So
Oh yeah.
like my crystallizing experiences were around things like action sports and writing, which remain my two greatest entrance ways into flow. You know what I mean? That never
Yes.
changed. And I didn't know. I mean, one of the reasons I asked the question is like I didn't know if that's just me or if that's everybody.
Definitely me too. But I think that throughout the ages, you look at that, we'd write that about that in our book, Wire to Create. That's a very common experience. And you link that to flow is quite brilliant, I think. Yeah. And there should be more research on that.
And then Scott, let's go back to the growth definition. We had a few more people paying in there wanting to hear your answer to that. So Choose Growth is the name of the book. Maybe you can tell us about the thesis of the book as well. Maybe it's a little early for that, but either way, let's define what you mean by growth in the title.
Sure. How do you define growth? Well, this is a billion-dollar question. I mean, if you could know precisely what are growth behaviors and what aren't, within you, and you could then hack your whole system and do that. But the point of life is it's a journey to find out what is growth for you and what isn't growth for you. And I think there are certain signs that you're moving in the direction of growth. I mean, Carl Rogers, the humanistic psychologist who I draw on his work a lot, he argued for the OVP. He called it the OVP. Are you down with your OVP? Yeah, you know me. So anyway, the OVP stands for the
Notorious SBK.
Yeah. You ready for what the OVP stands for? It's a mouthful.
Yeah, please.
Organismic valuing process. Basically what he meant is that there are certain things we have built into all of us, a certain valuing process that allows us to know whether or not the actions we're engaging are good for the whole organism or not. Deep down in your gut when you're being an asshole to someone. Like, you could justify it in a million different ways, but experientially your organism knows. That if you're eating chocolate and just all night long and you want to be on a diet, that you're not really, you can justify it in a million different ways, but your organism knows. There are things that what do you think, Steven? Yeah, Steven's got an idea.
Well, so the other what I was wondering about is, where do you draw the line around the organism? Because there are a lot of behaviors that are sort of like, if I want to say the organism ends with Steven versus I'm a part of a global system, right? Like it's one planet and I'm part of an ecosystem. So I can do things that are good for Steven, the organism, and bad for the ecosystem as a whole, right? And so what I was wondering about is that seems very selfish in comparison to Maslow's ideas of self-actualization as bringing in others and the world, etc.
Great point.
That's
point.
What I was thinking.
But the fascinating kicker to this, in terms of what the research shows, that Kenneth Sheldon has shown over and over again, is that when you make growth-oriented behaviors, the pro-sociality parts come along for the ride, like almost all the time. It's fascinating. You didn't have to be
That's the same argument I make about flow, right?
I know.
You get the pro-social behaviors. Okay.
Yes.
All right.
Yes.
Okay. I get that.
So
or at least I get to shut up because he's agreeing with me.
Yeah, he's agreeing with you. Lots of a whole nexus of correlations. He distinguished between growth-oriented behaviors, and I mean they've actually tested this. He's tested the OVP, the existence of the OVP. Does it really exist in humans? And he found that over time, people do course correct. People do start to make decisions that are more in line with growth, and they are aversive to ones that are away from growth. It's a very optimistic view of humans. I understand that we don't always live up to this, but there are things that we know are helping us grow as a whole person and not just a narrow slice of us, help us grow to our fullest potential. And when we're moving into our fullest potential, we have lots of things that come along for that, like physiological things that make us feel more alive. What are the things you engage in where you feel more vital, you feel more alive, you feel more generative, explorative, that dopamine is really pumping, you're like full of possibility, versus what are the things you engage in that feel really good in the moment, but immediately you just want to sleep afterwards. You don't want to grow afterwards. So we have these things built into us. Just how much do we listen to them is the question.
That makes sense.
Let's do two more questions from folks here, and then we'll close out. Do peak experiences occur more frequently as you live a transcendent life? Or do they happen more at the beginning of that journey, perhaps related to a healing of sorts or restructuring of older neural pathways? I'll repeat the whole thing actually, because there's a few bits to it. So do peak experiences occur more frequently as you live a transcendent life?
Yes.
Or do they happen more
Yes.
at the beginning of that journey?
We've just answered that first one, or more the begin. With the second part
Second
was
part is, do they happen more at the beginning of that journey, perhaps related to a healing of sorts or restructuring of older neural pathways?
Sort of similar with some of the meditative paths. Certainly in the beginning on a flow path, you get bigger highs. The flow high is bigger, and can be much bigger. I think over time, you have more flow states, but they're not like the huge, spectacular fireworks you used to get in the beginning. And it's not because you can't get there. It's because you choose not to ride the high that high because it's very expensive for the organism to get there. You have those kinds of flow experiences, and then you do what Scott said. You go home and sleep for like 2 days, and there's not a whole lot of growth. So I think some of what happens as we progress on this path with flow, toward transcendence, all that stuff, is the lows are less low and the highs are less high. This is what people talk about as the middle path.
Beautiful.
And that sounds like you're sacrificing quality of experience for some kind of like mediocrity, and that's actually not it at all. Those less high states, I think, become equally, if not more rewarding, but they're the pyrotechnics are quieter, I think. Does that make any sense, Scott?
Maslow called it the plateau experience.
Yeah, exactly.
And he said it's like you're lounging in heaven, but not getting so excited about it. Yeah.
I think that's absolutely correct. Yeah, that's that. Yeah, exactly. I think you move more towards that. Those big mystical experiences, those big flow state experiences, they're exhausting. I mean, they just are. You can't shatter the self that completely without it sort of having a cost over time, I think.
That's exactly right. And this links to this conversation. We were both interested in fear of death. This discussion we were talking about back channel before this. Yeah. When Maslow, the last 18 years of his life, he experienced a heart attack and he knew he was going to die. He could die any second, again, not again, he didn't die, but he had a heart attack. He was in the hospital. He knew that the real one, the one that kills him, could come at any time. And he called that the post-mortem life. And he described that post-mortem life as the most transcendent time period of his whole entire life. And he said that the plateau experiences is where it was that gave him that transcendence, not the peak experiences. That was what was a big insight in his life, the last 18 months or so of his life. And he argued that everyone should be able to die and then come back and have a post-mortem life, that they would all feel the highest heights of transcendence imaginable.
I love that, Scott. Here's an interesting question. Would it be fair to say that transcendence comes and goes as has been emphasized with flow, or is it fully stable? So I think that you feel free to speak more broadly to the kind of permanence of transcendence. Can you regress and kind of slide back down? And
100%.
Speak to that, Scott.
Well, yeah, that's because that's life. Life is, like Maslow said, it's like 2 steps forward, 1 step back, dynamic of development. You can go, okay, just to give an example, you can go to the top of the Himalayas and become a monk and avoid all humans and everything and come down feeling enlightened. And then the first moment you reconnect with your mother, starts yelling at you, "Why didn't you do the dishes?" You're back. So look, life is, you could try to avoid life your whole life, but is that really fully living? I think to fully live means to regress. You can call it regression, or you can just calling it jumping fully into the stream of life.
Let me see. I've got one final question here, and then we'll wrap. So where does awe fit into transcendence? Assuming that the definition of awe is that sense of being small yet interconnected to something larger than ourselves.
Where does all fit into transcendence, right? I mean, I view it on the continuum. It's in my continuum. It's there. It's next to inspiration. I believe the close cousin is inspiration, but it's not exactly the same thing. And it's to the right of gratitude. So it's in between gratitude and inspiration in my model. I created an all experience questionnaire that has various characteristics of all that I argue differentiate it from other kinds of self-transcendent experiences, but it's definitely a self-transcendent experience in my model. It does satisfy those dual requirements that they all satisfy, but then they all have add-ons that are different. But the two are, reduced sense of self as well as a connection with the world at large. Yeah.
Stephen, have you seen any literature, or do you have any thoughts on whether awe may trigger flow or assist in triggering flow?
So I think awe is always present in flow. I actually think the state of awe, and once we get precise sort of neurobiological definitions of it, and I know Scott's done a lot of work on here, I think that view, let's say there's a view, a perspective that is there. I think it's built in as part of the flow state. And it's, when we say things like flow improves ecological awareness, right? Our ability to see and perceive the natural world, and that's a regular part of the flow experience. That's the awe side of it. Like, that's what Scott's talking about exactly. So I think awe as an experience is always, in a sense, the neurobiologically contained within a flow state. I think it's a question of where are you putting your attention? When you're having an awe experience, you're looking up in the night sky and you're contemplating the vast. That could be a flow experience as well as an awe experience. But I think in flow, you might take it. You might not, but you might take it farther and try to turn that experience into creativity. Whereas in an awe experience, you might just merge with the sky and feel that oneness. Whereas in flow, you might want to write a song or a poem about it. Would be, and I could be really wrong here, and I'm playing fast and loose with a bunch of definitions to get us out on time. But
that's really beautiful. Well, it's really interesting that some people describe awe as reverence, or the add-on. How I said some of these self-transcendent experiences have add-ons or unique flavors to them. What would be the unique flavor of awe? Well, it seems to be this interesting mixture of emotions that don't tend to get mixed together, which is fear and reverence mixed in with wonder and contemplation, like trying to assimilate something that it doesn't immediately assimilate into your schemas, your everyday schemas, right? So that's a very unique.
Yeah, and off of what you just said, right? Normally, the organism, and it's because norepinephrine governs these systems, we either feel curiosity or anxiety, right? It's an either or. And if you look into the great Temple Grandin's work, she talks about how most mammals, until you sort of get into the higher social mammals and humans, it's either or. They either feel anxiety or curiosity. It's only in the higher mammals and humans that you start to get both at once. And awe is, as Scott just pointed out, is an extreme example of this. And in a sense, it's basically the ability to hold both sides of norepinephrine in your head at once without getting shifted to one or the other, anxiety or curiosity. It's the ability to stabilize both. And there must be something neurobiological going on that allows us to stabilize this in the awe experience, I would guess, but I don't know what that would be.
Great answer, guys. Appreciate that. Final question is for you, Scott. So one of the questions Stephen constantly gets is, what are the 3 things I can do Monday morning to get more access to flow? So I'm curious for you, what are 3 things people can do either tomorrow morning or next Monday morning to really start moving toward self-actualization and transcendence?
Well, I do outline 7 principles of becoming a whole person in my book, which actually forming the foundation of a self-actualization coaching program I'm developing. But some of those, so 3, let me just see if I can pick out 3 from that 7. And a big part of self-actualization is getting really comfortable with your dark side and in integrating it. And I would meditate on the areas of yourself that you're most shameful of. Meditate on the areas of yourself that you really hide under the rug the most, and you don't even want to confront. And I would argue practice the art of confronting it. with deep meditation, and let it lose some of its power, and let it harness the dark side. Let it integrate. We'll have some exercises on that in the Choose Growth book coming out this year. Another so get comfortable with or harness the power of your dark side. I would also really get deeply in touch with your values and your goal structure. Like really write out your goal structure, like starting with like the top level dream, top level goal, down to the middle level of goals that are supporting that you also do in your life, and then how you're realizing each of those goals in the middle. So you can really come up with a whole goal structure and really plan out your life. Like think thoughtfully through how are all these things feeding into each other for that top level goal. Just so that you make sure that you're constantly choosing growth, right? You're kind of constantly choosing that top level goal that you have. And then the third one would probably be to inject more fun into your life. I think we underestimate the extent to which fun can help.
Was that your Sesame Street voice?
Maybe
was that
it
your
was.
Sesame Street? Oh, yeah. Okay.
Not quite sure what that verse was, but I think that was my Yoda. It is.
Now you're doing Yoda. Yeah. No.
Fun it must
all
be.
things descend towards Yoda.
Fun you have, and you have fun, and I just think that there's a big part of self-actualization that is, I mean, I know we talked earlier. Are there states that are aimless? Really, can that be possible, considering we're cybernetic systems? And I think that's an interesting intellectual question, but I do think that we can get darn close sometimes to a certain state where the outcome or the goal is unpredictable, and at the very least you have not consciously set out the goal for yourself, and have some fun in life with that, to open yourself up to new possibilities, and wherever things go, let it emerge naturally. Set some time in your life for unpredictable play.
Super. Thank you everybody for attending. We'll be doing these on the regular again, so we'll see you all soon.
See y'all soon. Bye.
Alrighty.
Bye.
All the best.
If what you've heard on Flow Research Collective Radio has been helpful, please consider doing us a solid and leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you are listening to this. Reviews help us connect to a wider audience so we can get these peak performance principles out to more people.